that the reason Miss Matty wouldn't order a pudding today? She said she had no great fancy for sweet things, and you and she would just have a mutton chop. But I'll be up to her. Never you tell, but I'll make her a pudding, and a pudding she'll like too, and I'll pay for it myself, so mind you see she eats it. Many a one has been comforted in their sorrow by seeing a good dish come upon the table. I was rather glad that Martha's energy had taken the immediate and practical direction of pudding making, for it staved off the quarrelsome discussions as to whether she should or should not leave Miss Matty's service. She began to tie on a clean apron, and otherwise prepare herself for going to the shop for the butter, eggs, and what else she might require. She would not use a scrap of the articles already in the house for her cookery, but went to an old teapot in which her private store of money was deposited, and took out what she wanted. I found Miss Matty very quiet, and not a little sad, but by and by she tried to smile for my sake. It was settled that I was to write to my father, and ask him to come over and hold a consultation, and as soon as this letter was dispatched, we began to talk over the future plans. Miss Matty's idea was to take a single room, and retain as much of her furniture as would be necessary to fit up this, and sell the rest, and there to quietly exit upon what would remain after paying the rent. For my part, I was more ambitious and less contented. I thought of all the things by which a woman past middle age, and with the education common to ladies 50 years ago, could earn or add to a living without materially losing caste. But at length I put even this last clause on one side, and wondered what in the world Miss Matty could do. Teaching was, of course, the first thing that suggested itself. If Miss Matty could teach children anything, it would throw her among the little elves in whom her soul delighted. I ran over her accomplishments. Once upon a time I had heard her say that she could play on the piano, but that was long, long ago. That faint shadow of musical acquirement had died out years before. She had also once been able to trace out patterns very nicely for muslin embroidery, by dint of placing a piece of silver paper over the design to be copied, and holding both against the window pane while she marked the scallop and eyelet holes. But that was her nearest approach to the accomplishment of drawing, and I did not think it would go very far. Then again, as to the branches of a solid English education, fancy work and the use of the globes, such as the mistress of the ladies' seminary, to which all the tradespeople in Cranford sent their daughters, professed to teach. Miss Matty's eyes were failing her, and I doubted if she could discover the number of threads in a worsted work pattern, or rightly appreciate the indifferent shades required for Queen Adelaide's face in the loyal wool work now fashionable in Cranford. As for the use of the globes, I had never been able to find it out myself, so perhaps I was not a good judge of Miss Matty's capability of instructing in this branch of education. But it struck me that equators and tropics and such mystical circles were very imaginary lines indeed to her, and that she looked upon the signs of the zodiac as so many remnants of the black art. What she piqued herself upon, as arts in which she excelled, was making candle lighters, or spills, as she preferred calling them, of colored paper, cut so as to resemble feathers, and knitting garters in a variety of dainty stitches. I had once said, on receiving a present of an elaborate pair, that I should feel quite tempted to drop one of them in the street in order to have it admired, but I found this little joke, and it was a very little one, was such a distress to her sense of propriety, and was taken with such anxious, earnest alarm lest the temptation might some day prove too strong for me, that I quite regretted having ventured upon it. A present of this delicately wrought garters, a bunch of gay spills, or a set of cards on which sewing silk was wound in a mystical manner were the well-known tokens of Miss Matty's favor. But would anyone pay to have their children taught these arts? Or indeed, would Miss Matty sell for filthy lucre the knack and the skill with which she made trifles of value to those who loved her? I had to come down to reading, writing, and arithmetic, and in reading the chapter every morning, she has always coughed before coming to long words. I doubted her power of getting through a genealogical chapter with any number of coughs. Writing she did well and delicately, but spelling? She seemed to think that the more out of the way this was, and the more trouble it cost her, the greater the compliment she paid to her correspondent, and words that she would spell quite correctly in her letters to me became perfect enigmas when she wrote to my father. No, there was nothing she could teach to the rising generation of Cranford, unless they had been quick learners and ready imitators of her patience, her humility, her sweetness, her quiet contentment with all that she could not do. I pondered and pondered until dinner was announced by Martha, with a face all blubbered and swollen with crying. Miss Matty had a few little peculiarities which Martha was apt to regard as whims below her attention, and appeared to consider as childish fancies of which an old lady of 58 should try and cure herself. But today everything was attended to with the most careful regard. The bread was cut to the imaginary pattern of excellence that existed in Miss Matty's mind, as being the way which her mother had preferred. The curtain was drawn so as to exclude the dead brick wall of a neighbor's stable, and yet left so as to show every tender leaf of the poplar which was bursting into spring beauty. Martha's tone to Miss Matty was just such as that good, rough-spoken servant usually kept sacred for little children, and which I had never heard her use to any grown-up person. I had forgotten to tell Miss Matty about the pudding, and I was afraid she might not do justice to it, for she had evidently very little appetite this day. So I seized the opportunity of letting her into the secret while Martha took away the meat. Miss Matty's eyes filled with tears, and she could not speak, either to express surprise or delight, when Martha returned bearing it aloft, made in the most wonderful representation of a lion couch-hand that ever was molded. Martha's face gleamed with triumph as she set it down before Miss Matty with an exultant "There!" Miss Matty wanted to speak her thanks, but could not. So she took Martha's hand and shook it warmly, which set Martha off crying, and I myself could hardly keep up the necessary composure. Martha burst out of the room, and Miss Matty had to clear her voice once or twice before she could speak. At last she said, "I should like to keep this pudding under a glass shade, my dear," and the notion of the lion couchant with his currant eyes being hoisted up to the place of honor on a mantelpiece tickled my hysterical fancy, and I began to laugh, which rather surprised Miss Matty. "I am sure, dear, I have seen uglier things under a glass shade before now," said she. So had I, many a time and oft, and I accordingly composed my countenance, and now I could hardly keep from crying, and we both fell to upon the pudding, which was indeed excellent, only every morsel seemed to choke us, our hearts were so full. We had too much to think about to talk much that afternoon. It passed over very tranquilly. But when the tea-urn was brought in, a new thought came into my head. Why should not Miss Matty sell tea, be an agent to the East India Tea Company, which then existed? I could see no objection to this plan, while the advantages were many, always supposing that Miss Matty could get over the degradation of condescending to anything like trade. Tea was neither greasy nor sticky, grease and stickiness being two of the qualities which Miss Matty could not endure. No shop window would be required. A small genteel notification of her being licensed to sell tea would, it is true, be necessary, but I hoped that it could be placed where no one would see it. Neither was tea a heavy article, so as to tax Miss Matty's fragile strength. The only thing against my plan was the buying and selling involved. While I was giving but absent answers to the questions Miss Matty was putting almost as absently, we heard a clumping sound on the stairs and a whispering outside the door, which indeed once opened and shut as if by some invisible agency. After a little while, Martha came in, dragging after her a great tall young man, all crimson with shyness, and finding his only relief in perpetually sleeking down his hair. "Please, ma'am, he's only Jim Hearn," said Martha, by way of an introduction. And so out of breath was she that I imagined she had had some bodily struggle before she could overcome his reluctance to be presented on the courtly scene of Miss Matilda Jenkins' drawing-room. "And please, ma'am, he wants to marry me offhand. And please, ma'am, we want to take a lodger, just one quiet lodger, to make our two ends meet. And we'd take any house comfortable. And, oh dear Miss Matty, if I may be so bold, would you have any objection to lodging with us? Jim wants it as much as I do." To Jim, "You great oaf, why can't you back me? But he does want it all the same. Very bad, don't you, Jim? Only you see, He's dazed at being called on to speak before quality." "It's not that," broke in Jim. "It's that you've taken me all on a sudden, and I didn't think for to get married so soon, and such quick words does flabbergast a man. It's not that I'm against it, ma'am," addressing Miss Matty, "only Martha was such quick ways with her when once she takes a thing into her head. And marriage, ma'am, marriage nails a man, as one may say. I dare say I shan't mind it after it's once over." "Please, ma'am," said Martha, who had plucked at his sleeve and nudged him over with her elbow, and otherwise tried to interrupt him all the time he had been speaking. "Don't mind him. He'll come to. 'Twas only last night he was an-axing me, and all the more because I said I could not think of it for years to come, and now he's only taken aback with the suddenness of the joy. But you know, Jim, you're just as full as me about wanting a lodger." Another great nudge. "Aye, if Miss Matty would lodge with us. Otherwise, I've no mind to be cucumbered with strange folk in the house," said Jim, with a want of tact which I could see enraged Martha, who was trying to represent a lodger as the great object they wished to obtain, and that, in fact, Miss Matty would be smoothing their path and conferring a favor if she would only come and live with them. Miss Matty herself was bewildered by the pair. Or rather Martha's sudden resolution in favor of matrimony staggered her, and stood between her and the contemplation of the plan which Martha had at heart. Miss Matty began. "Marriage is a very solemn thing, Martha." "It is indeed, ma'am," quoth Jim. "Not that I've no objection to Martha." "You've never let me be for asking me for to fix when I would be married," said Martha, her face all afire and ready to cry with vexation. "And now you're shaming me before my missus and all." "Nay, now, Martha, don't he? Only a man likes to have breathing time," said Jim, trying to possess himself of her hand, but in vain. Then, seeing that she was more seriously hurt than he had imagined, he seemed to try to rally his scattered faculties with more straightforward dignity than 10 minutes before I should have thought it possible for him to assume. He turned to Miss Matty and said, "I hope, ma'am, you know that I am bound to respect everyone who has been kind to Martha. I always looked on her as to be my wife, sometime, and she has often spoken of you as the kindest lady there ever was. And though the plain truth is, I would not like to be troubled with lodgers of the common run, yet if, ma'am, you'd honor us by living with us, I'm sure Martha would do her best to make you comfortable, and I'd keep out of your way as much as I could, which I reckon would be the best kindness such as an awkward chap as me could do." Miss Matty had been very busy with taking off her spectacles, wiping them and replacing them, but all she could say was, "Don't let any thought of me hurry you into marriage. Pray don't. Marriage is such a very solemn thing." "But Miss Matilda will think of your plan, Martha," said I, struck with the advantages that it offered, and unwilling to lose the opportunity of considering about it. "And I'm sure neither she nor I can ever forget your kindness, nor yours either, Jim." "Why, yes, ma'am, I'm sure I mean kindly, though I'm a bit fluttered by being pushed straight ahead into matrimony, as it were, and may not express myself comfortably, but I'm sure I'm willing enough, and give me time to get accustomed. So, Martha, wench, what's the use of crying so, and slapping me if I come near?" This last was sotto voce, and had the effect of making Martha bounce out of the room, to be followed and soothed by her lover, whereupon Miss Matty sat down and cried very heartily, and accounted for it by saying that the thought of Martha being married so soon gave her quite a shock, and that she should never forgive herself if she thought she was hurrying the poor creature. I think my pity was more for Jim of the two, but both Miss Matty and I appreciated to the full the kindness of the honest couple, although we said little about this, and a good deal about the changes and dangers of matrimony. The next morning, very early, I received a note from Miss Pole, so mysteriously wrapped up, and with so many seals on it to secure secrecy, that I had to tear the paper before I could unfold it. And when I came to the writing, I could hardly understand the meaning. It was so involved and oracular. I made out, however, that I was to go to Miss Pole's at 11 o'clock, the number 11 being written in full length as well as in numerals, and A.M. twice dashed under, as if I were very likely to come at 11 at night, when all Cranford was usually abed and asleep by 10. There was no signature except Miss Pole's initials reversed, P.E. But as Martha